I'm Jim Check. You're watching Kelowna Now. I have with me Ian Burns. He's back now. He's back from his migraine. We're going to talk about Bill C-18. Ian did a story on Friday talking about the Liberals ending their Meta boycott on the Bill C-18. Maybe just kind of go through that article a bit, Ian.
Yeah, well, it was actually CTV that did this. They sort of got the scoop last week where I'm not sure how. They didn't really explain how they got this scoop, but I guess somebody probably just sent them an email or one of their reporters just saw a government ad on Facebook or Instagram, I suppose. But they just went and asked the federal government, and it was the Privy Council office for some reason that answered the question and told them that yes, as of January the 23rd, they've um, they've put up $100,000 for the federal government to advertise its GST HST tax break, which expires in a few days, I believe. So I guess they just wanted to maximize that little policy of theirs. Anyway, and then I looked at it and I spoke to the same people, and they told me that in the intervening period, which is just a couple of days, that they'd allotted another 180,000 or just under $180,000 for a campaign on housing and another campaign for Parks Canada. And this is interesting. If anybody's wondering why that's interesting, it's because the federal government or the Liberal Party and Meta are officially at war. They officially kind of really don't like each other, and that's because of the Online News Act, which was an attempt by the federal government. They say it was an attempt to get these big American tech companies to pay a little bit of cash into journalism, really, or independent journalism, so that they could continue to do the valuable service that they do in communities across Canada. Uh, and that, well, that's what they said anyway. That's what they said it was about. That's not how it's worked, because in the end, we've all been blocked from Facebook and Instagram. All news in Canada is blocked from
Yeah.
Facebook, Instagram.
Caught in the crossfires as our organization. We lost our audience of 200,000, and we haven't gotten any subsidies from the government. So we've been going without our audience, had our revenues halved, and this we can't seem to appeal to Facebook or to the federal government. Neither one seem to want to listen to us, and it's hurt media and actually put communities at risk during the fire season and stuff like that. People were scrambling to share news because you can't put any news on Facebook or Meta right now, and that's part of what's really kind of disheartening is what their reasoning for starting to advertise on Meta was that, oh, we need to get this important information out about the Liberal policies, though, so as we're coming up to an election, because we realize that most Canadians get their news from social media.
Yeah,
It's really hard to stomach that when that's what the news organizations have been saying. You blocked news organizations, so now you're literally paying Meta, which you started this fight with, to put your information on there that's so important. But when there was fires going on or floods and that kind of stuff, that information wasn't important enough because it didn't concern, I guess, the Liberal Party and their need to get the message out.
well, it does seem a little bit self-serving, doesn't it? Considering that this GST holiday or whatever it is that they're calling it, that was kind of the last roll of the dice for the Liberals, wasn't it? I mean, that's generally how it's understood. Anyway, it was the last attempt of the Liberal Party to try and turn the polls around, because
Yeah.
obviously
The,
they've
the,
been a distant second to the Conservatives now for about a year, 18 months, something like that. Um, yeah, and I guess the fear was that not many people really knew about it, so they wanted to get it out there. But if you think, and this is one of the questions that I asked. I asked a question of Heritage Canada, and I also asked a series of questions of the Privy Council. I actually said, why this? Why have you why is this the moment to break this principle that you're standing up for, to sacrifice this principle? Why have you broken the boycott to promote a tax break? It doesn't really seem to make sense, does it? Because if you think about all of the huge things, and that example that I said in that question, I just said, how come you didn't do it to try and reassure Canadians that the federal government was had this tariff war with Trump in hand. It's like, it's okay, don't fear. I know the news is scary right now, but we've got this. We're going to help you, and all the rest of it. Why was it not about that? Instead, it was about a tax break. I mean, it was essentially about a sort of what the Globe and Mail, I think a Globe and Mail, anyway, a lot of newspapers in Canada, many of them sort of traditionally aligned with the Liberals, have called this basically like a cynical kind of election ploy, like an attempt to win the election, basically. That it's not
Well,
solid policy.
even the deputy prime minister, well, the past one, Chrystia Freeland, and the finance minister said it was, when in her resignation letter, said it was nothing more than a political gimmick, this GST break on tinsel and tacos.
Yep, exactly. So why is it that which is contentious? What is not contentious, what nobody would doubt, is, for example, the idea that this tariff situation is terrifying, and that maybe people would understand that, or something to do with the wildfires, um,
Mm-hmm.
because
Well, EB,
obviously,
our premier EB asked for them to break it during the wildfires, and there was a no go on that. And we actually had Justin Trudeau here in town. We got a question in, even though they tried to not let us be at the event. We got a question in, and we asked about the Meta ban and Bill C-18, and then Trudeau went into this, like 3 or 5 minute speech on never bowing down in the fight against Meta.
yeah, and he also said something that um, everybody in his pretty much everybody in his cabinet that's ever been asked questions about this has said as well, which is that Meta is almost like dangerous. It's full of misinformation, and it's full of very sketchy characters who are spreading all kinds of horrible ideas about things that the Liberals don't like, and fundamentally that it threatens democracy, which is the favorite the kind of rallying cry of the Liberal Party in the last few years has been like, we're going to defend democracy. And they've very much cast Meta and Mark Zuckerberg as, if not enemies of democracy, then, a grave risk of becoming enemies of democracy. And you would think, what was it, last 2 weeks ago or something, that Mark Zuckerberg made that announcement about changing up his whole fact-checking regime and actually getting rid of the fact checkers and moving the moderators to Texas so that they're not too left-wing biased and all the rest of it. You would think, wouldn't you, after all that, Zuckerberg took quite a big hit for that. He took like a reputational hit from the liberal left, or on the liberal left. You would think that this was all the more reason for the liberals to stick to their guns. But strangely, that's the almost exact time that they dropped their boycott. Just when Zuckerberg sort of tries to align his platforms more with Trump and the right, or the center, however you want to perceive it, that's the time that the liberals say, all right, we're going to drop this boycott now about this company that we said is, pretty much a risk, a threat to democracy.
So we've done so many stories on this. So they've selectively chosen a few media outlets, mostly legacy media outlets, to fund during this crisis. So this fight is almost, this Meta fight will be about 2 years come this June. It'll be 2 years since we've been allowed to put our information on that platform, which was our biggest source of audience, and no compensation for us. And then a lot of these other outlets, like, over $1 billion has been sent subsidizing other outlets right now. But if you look at the amount of failures in media right now, like you did the story a while ago, and I think there was like 58 media outlets have failed across Canada. Many have laid people off. And if you look at the stock charts of Chorus, which is global news, I mean, it looks really bad. Even if you look at the stock chart of Glacier Media or Post Media, all of them are all really suffering. So here's the Liberals saying they're doing this to save media, and then the exact opposite has really happened.
Yeah, it's one of those things where their stated aim of trying to kind of bolster the media and put it on a secure footing has not only failed, but in the end they've managed to achieve the exact opposite. Yeah, and they've killed a number of platforms have just died altogether. But I think a lot of other platforms have kind of they can't be as ambitious, really. They can't do as much as what they might want to do because they just can't have the staff. They can't it might even come down to things like capital expenses as well. They can't buy things that they might want to buy. If you don't have revenue coming in, you can't really operate in a sort of particularly strong way. And that's anybody that's familiar now with the Canadian media scene realizes that that's how things are right now. And that's even when you're looking at the subsidized platforms. There's platforms that are actually having large chunks of their journalists' salaries paid for by the taxpayer. Even they quite sort of evidently aren't doing very well, and they don't seem to have all that much ambition,
Well,
and they're not trying to innovate or anything like that.
traffic has been like halved across all platforms, and it's like, and they recognize, you did a story just recently as well, that it's been recognized that Canadians get a lot of their news from social media, and they've been reading a lot less news. I was interviewed by the National, and we talked about that same thing about, Canadians are reading a lot less news because there's a lot less access to news.
Yeah, but I would say, in relation to that, what you just said, and earlier as well, you said all news has been banned on Facebook. That's true in the sense that all journalists have been banned from Facebook. I think that's maybe a better way to phrase it, because all news has not been banned from Facebook because we've talked about. I feel like we pick on this guy, and I don't mean to, and I know you don't mean to, but there's that Canada Proud website, which
Yeah,
just or whatever it
steal
is. It's not even a
information.
website, is it?
Yeah,
That is the perfect embodiment of what has now happened to social media when it comes to news in Canada. This guy, and it is just one guy. I think the CBC tracked him down and interviewed him, and he seemed like in that interview he came across quite well actually. He didn't seem like he was a particularly bad dude or anything. But what he does is he just scours the news websites, finds stories, and kind of summarizes them or takes clips and posts them on Facebook. And for some reason, that isn't news, even though all he
yeah,
does is all he does is summarize the work of journalists, and then he gets like thousands and thousands of comments and interactions.
yeah. He's taken our information many times. And
Yeah.
it's frustrating because he's built this huge social media following using the work of journalists, and he's allowed to post it, and we're not.
Well, he's kind of like, again, like I really don't want to sort of pick on this dude, but it's almost like, during prohibition of alcohol, naturally, when you do something as stupid as that, as a government, when you make a mistake as colossally bad as prohibition, you will create a sort of a legal regime or a system where somebody comes in to fill it, or certain groups come in to fill it. And I'm not trying to say that he's like a bootlegger or Al Capone or whatever, but naturally, there's a demand for news. Social media is the main kind of medium nowadays. That's how people that's where things are posted and discussed. So if you create a situation, as the Liberals have done, where news, like legitimate news, is banned on social media, then bootleggers of a sort are going to come in and fill that, demand. And that's exactly what people like that have done. But I mean, it isn't even just that. People just take screenshots of our website and other people's websites, obviously, as well. And on a number of occasions, I've even seen people quite literally copy and paste our entire articles and just paste them onto Facebook as a post, and also with the images. One of the stories done by Gord, who our sort of Penticton stringer, which had like a load of photographs. It was about 2,000 words long or something like that. He does those features.
Yeah,
And so, yeah, somebody just copied and pasted the whole text, and then downloaded all the images and posted them on Facebook. That, I mean, so it's in many ways it's even worse than just a ban on news, because it's like it's a ban on journalists. And it allows these people, should they choose to manipulate this content in any way that they want. And sometimes they'll only show you like 6 paragraphs from a story, and they'll miss the bit where, as journalists, we've gone and asked the other side, as you have to do, like to write a balanced article. They'll miss that bit, and they'll just give you the bit that like supports their agenda. And then it looks like news. Sometimes they'll even say, "Oh, I saw this on the news," and it's kind of in every possible way, it's undermined. The Liberals' favorite thing, I would say, democracy. This undermines democracy in quite a profound way, um, in the sense that the media can have any effect on democracy.
And we've done a ton of stories. And you interviewed the law professor, Michael Geist, um, and you maybe share some of his thoughts from what the liberals have done to media.
Yeah, Michael Ghost is he's a very he's a very amusing and articulate critic, I think, of the Liberals' attempts to regulate the media. He's upset about not just C18, but quite a number of bills that the government's put through. But yeah, we should say who he is. I mean, he's a law professor at the University of Ottawa. Um, he specializes, I think, in like media law, copyright law, that kind of thing. But he sort of said, in his view, well, number one, he thinks it's extremely stupid because he refers to it as a link tax. He refers to it as a tax on links, like because if you post your links to a news site on Facebook under the Online News Act, anyway, you're supposed to then Facebook's then supposed to compensate the news organization that posts those links, basically. So he calls that like equivalent to a tax. Which also he pointed out it only targets two companies as well, Google and Meta. So already it was a little bit questionable in that sense because obviously the Americans absolutely hate that. They hate it when their companies are targeted in Europe and places like that. But yeah, he just thought that it was a fight that they shouldn't have picked and that they couldn't win. He said that he thought it was a legislative error, that it was a mistake that they'd made through incompetence. But then once they'd made that mistake, they were too stubborn to fix it. Um, and he also said that in his view, he thinks that news would come back if the Liberals dropped the bill. That was essentially his view on it. But it is interesting. I mentioned Google there. We should probably say Google paid $100 million to be exempted from this legislation. So Meta just blocked all news. They said we're not going to play this game.
Yeah,
But
Meta's
Google paid
argument was
a
that
$100 million.
Meta's argument was that they should be paying Meta for the putting our news on there because they said we give traffic, and when we believe it was a symbiotic relationship. We willingly put our content on Facebook, as did every other outlet. Meta does not steal anything. We willingly put our content on Meta in exchange for traffic because it brings traffic back and was our leading traffic provider. So it was a symbiotic relationship. But some publishers, some of the bigger publishers in legacy media, I guess, pressured the government to do this and forced Meta to pay because they'd been losing advertising dollars to Meta and Google and the likes. But at the end of it, it's an utter disaster for independent journalism. And they were warned by the conservatives at the time that outlets like ourselves, digital media outlets, would be the losers, like the big losers in this mess. And sure enough, that's what it is.
Yep, absolutely. And a number of people have said that and noticed that. I mean, look, I don't think you need to be an expert on these topics to see why it would be so disastrous. I mean, how many people nowadays, even among ourselves, I mean, how many people do you know that like have a list of websites that they go to every day? And that's how they kind of navigate the internet. It's like, okay, I'm gonna go to this website, this web. It's not really how it happens, is it? Like you find links, you stumble upon links. That's the whole point of social media in a way. So if you remove that, then you remove the kind of the serendipity of it, don't you? And it means that people have to just literally type in, theglobeandmail.com or something like that, or get the app or whatever. And I think it just seems like the most obvious thing in the world, really, that traffic would collapse in an environment like that. But I don't know, it feels a little bit like that the Liberals or the federal government didn't really have the right to they didn't really have the right to take that gamble with an entire kind of sector of the economy, if you want to call it that, or kind of subsector of the economy,
They've,
because
they,
obviously it must have crossed their mind. There must be a document somewhere in the federal government where somebody warns and says, okay, like possible negative outcomes, Facebook blocks news in Canada. That must have entered their minds, surely.
it's
So in
really
that sense, they've kind of gambled with the whole news sector and obviously lost.
it's really made news outlets in Canada really reliant on government handouts. And that's one of the things that people should be scared of in the beginning, is that the government now is the one that's feeding these outlets. And obviously that's not a great place to be for independent journalism, is that that's the only way they're surviving. Because I talk to people in the United States and I say that we're blocked, and they're just like, no, you're not. Like, that's like, how could that be? They just can't even comprehend that news in Canada is blocked on Facebook and Instagram. And again, the I would say the beneficiary to all of this, if there is a beneficiary, would be the government having like massive control over media outlets, and to the detriment of most media outlets. Now they're basically, hand in mouth, having their survival depends on it.
Yeah, well, that was the. It's interesting how this is kind of split down partisan lines, and all the sort of different partisans interpret it according to their kind of, the way that they perceive the world. But I remember we spoke to John Rustad, and he sort of looked at it along those lines. It's like this is like sorry, this is like government control of the media. And he was saying that it's like Banana Republic sort of behavior. But then we spoke to, or you spoke to David Eby, and we also spoke to Ravi Parmar, who's now the
Yeah.
forestry minister, and their view was very, very classic NDP, wasn't it? It was like the corporations, like they're coming in, they're
Mhm.
kind of these vultures, I believe is what David Eby said. But I mean, caught in the middle of this pretty sort of banal political argument is the likes of our platform and many other independent platforms who kind of don't really take a side, aren't partisan in any way, but are kind of being gobbled up by this feud.
And our criticism for sure has been that the Conservative part of the official opposition in Canada has been relatively silent on this. For like we've sent many a request, and we've and I know that they like their big thing is defund the CBC and that, and I would agree that defunding all media outlets is the best course of action for media, and allow media to operate, but also give us back what we earned, and that audience is what we earned. And we went out and earned that. We didn't get any money for that. That's ours, and taking that away from us actually hinders our ability to operate.
Yeah, it does surprise me, and I feel like maybe I should write an editorial about that or a story about that at some point because I feel like not many people realize that the Conservative Party aren't really saying anything about this. I mean, in the past they've sort of said a couple of things here and there, like Pierre
Yeah.
Poilievre has
Dan
sort of
Elbus has
said that he
written some
doesn't like,
stuff. Dan Elbus, Tracy Gray
yeah,
have written some things, but
Tracy
they
Gray,
haven't
Dan
taken a
Albus. That,
strong position on it, though.
no, but I mean they've had strong words, Albus and Tracy Gray, and Pierre, like I said, quite a while ago, did speak negatively of the Online News Act and sort of suggested that he would get rid of it. But when you think about what his platform is, I should probably focus on Pierre here, and I sort of meant to there rather than the Conservative Party in general. But if you think about Pierre Poilievre's platform, it's all about getting the government out of the way and kind of liberating businesses and individuals so that they can do things. Like classic sort of post-war conservative ideology, or kind of like post Reagan Thatcherite style ideology of like maximum freedom within the market kind of thing, and all the rest of it. And he's all about the bureaucrats who are kind of trying to like control your life and they don't know what they're doing. But it's very interesting, and like I say, I feel like maybe we should kind of focus on this sometimes. He will not speak on this issue. The Conservative Party, for this story, for example, very interesting story, I would say. They send me emails quite often, the Conservative Party, and they're very upset if I don't add their comments to if I don't like instantly add their comments to some sort of story I do in the Conservatives. When it comes to this, it's just tumbleweed. I've sent them, I would say, probably a dozen emails on this subject, not a single response. They literally don't even respond. That's pretty weird, I would say. That's
Yeah,
pretty
and
unusual.
I
The
and I
federal government responds to emails usually. The Liberal Party will respond to emails. Conservative Party, crickets, nothing. They don't want to talk about it.
well, to be fair, we reached out to Pascal Saint Onge, I don't know how many times, to ask for comment and for an interview, and it took forever. Like, you basically had to, like, shame her into that quick interview you got, and she gave you like 5 minutes, and we couldn't even ask the questions we have. And I guess I should temper my thoughts on the conservative leader Pierre Poilievre is that, I mean, he has said that he's going to get rid of Bill C-18. I mean, as for us, it's not fast enough, right? Because I mean, we suffer through this daily with no communication from our federal government. Like we've sent how many appeals to even to Meta. We've asked them like, hey, if they won't consider us a news organization and give us the credit that everybody else has given us, then release us. And they've said, no, no, you're a news organization. You're not getting released. And even our closest competitor, that article you did with Mark Edge, our biggest competitor here in town, says, oh, yeah, they're definitely a news organization. And maybe you can talk about that article, that interview you did with Mark Edge.
Yeah, he was well, he's very much on the left, isn't he? And I think he's also an academic. But he's written a book about post media and its kind of malign influence on well, I don't know if I should say malign, but on its influence on Canadian politics. So he's certainly of the left, and he's got a kind of left critique of um of government control of the media, which I find very interesting because that's kind of gone away now. In general, that's like old fashioned. That's like Noam Chomsky style. Or Greenwald is another kind of like sort of Chomskyite type of lefty nowadays. But nowadays, the left is much more likely, in my view, anyway, as I see things, they're much more likely to want to prohibit access to information and talk about things like misinformation and block news and so on. So I found it quite interesting because that's just a bit of background. Anyway, he's like an old left kind of guy, but he was just very interested in one particular aspect. He was interested in the how they decide, because the federal government created a panel of people, many of them with not all that much journalism experience, but some of them do actually have quite a lot of journalism experience. But this panel refers to itself as an expert panel. They're the ones that decide whether or not you get the subsidy from the federal government, basically. They make that determination of in many ways it's like whether you live or die. It's this panel. And Mark was very interested in how they make that determination, really, because it is very, very vague language. And that's something that we've complained about as well, where they they don't they don't sort of list any particular requirements, really, or the requirements that they list are quite vague. It's like you must publish original content. Don't say how much original content. And if there's a few things like that, and yeah, he was quite intrigued by that. And I believe also Michael Geiss was interested in that because obviously that's what it all hinges on. If you accept or deny an application, basically tends to hinge on that the original content bit because that's what it all kind of focuses on. And they obviously determined that we didn't produce original content, even though of course we do, but they didn't say anything about how much you had to produce. And it seems to be that that's kind of because they looked at a lot of our stories and we use Canadian press and we write RCMP press releases up and stuff like that. And they looked at that and they said, "Oh, that doesn't count. That's not original." Even though we also obviously put out quite a lot of original content as well. And there's no kind of minimum. There's no this is the thing, like for something as important as this, talking about like hundreds of millions of dollars here, you would expect that would be pretty clear, wouldn't you? And it isn't. And I think that
I think it's
that was
intention.
his main interest.
A cynic would say it's intentionally left vague so that they can do this type of thing, because I would argue, and we have argued, that we have the most experienced newsroom in the Kelowna area. We have the guy that ran the CTV desk. So he was good enough to run the CTV desk here for, what, 10 years? And then we have,
Yeah.
one of the veterans from the Daily Courier that was, running the business editor there for 30 years. We have you that worked at the Daily Mail and has training from British journalism. And, Josh is the news director, been here like close to 10 years now. All of these people are trained from like BCIT and stuff like that. And yet, it's I think, like a cynic again would say that it's left vague so they can control who gets the crumbs and who doesn't. And we've seen media outlets fail across Canada. Even the ones getting the money are failing.
Yeah, I don't know how the hell they're managing to fail even when the government is paying, you
Well,
know,
look at CBC's.
two-thirds of the salaries of their reporters, but yeah, they are failing.
CBC just reached out and said what they need another 400 million or something in addition to the 1.5 billion they already get.
Just a little top up, please, my lord.
And they were doling out bonuses to the executive while they were laying staff off.
Yeah, that certainly doesn't look very good, does it?
I mean,
Especially when you think like it's not like they're breaking down the barriers of what's possible in journalism or anything like that. They're pretty much just doing what they always did.
the I would recommend that people go listen to that Justin Trudeau um, speech that he made. Though when we asked that question, when he went into that long thing, how he would never bow down to Meta, and
Yeah.
here it is. We're still suffering. We're still suffering because we don't have access to our audience. Facebook is winning because now the government, who's a big advertiser or was a big advertiser with Meta, is now advertising. And media outlets are still, the ones that are getting the subsidy, are still dependent on the government for their survival. Not a great place to be.
Yeah, I mean this to me is they've waved the white flag, clear as day. I mean Meta had already won completely. You
Yeah.
know
What?
Meta had won. I mean, as a journalist, you know which side has won based on which ones are most eager to get out their message. And the government has been quite eager, like you see with Trudeau here, to make moral arguments and lots of other arguments against Meta. Very noisy and, they're very interested in getting their argument across. Whereas Meta just haven't they literally have not said a single thing on this subject since I believe August 2023 when they posted a really short statement
Uh,
where they just
I'll,
said, in order to comply with the Online News Act, we will be blocking news for Canadian Facebook users, as of this date. That's it. It's like they haven't said anything, and that's because all along they've known that they're and I should say, off the record, I've been told by people that Meta almost just laugh at this. This is amusing to them. It's like an effortless victory for Meta. They do
yeah.
not care. They were
And I
never scared, and they're never going to be scared by the federal
and if
government.
you and if you look at the financials, that tells you a lot of who's having success and who's not. Since this has happened, about 2 years now, Meta's stock price has gone from 180 to 720, so about 400% up for Meta. So I don't think they're feeling the effects of being blocked, the news being blocked in Canada. They're definitely
Indeed.
that there's one of the strongest stock charts you can see is Meta's, and it's just and then if I pull up Chorus Entertainment, which is global news, and that thing, it looks like like it's like ready to go, and the thing was in 2022, beginning of 2022, was a $5 stock. Um, Today it's 9 cents. That in itself is so sad that this is what has happened to media. Like they're basically begging the government, like we are begging for our audience back or for a subsidy. We don't, at the end of the day, we don't want any money. We just want back the audience. I don't think any media should take money, but you also shouldn't have your foot on our throat at the same time.
Yeah, that's the thing. I mean, the Liberals stepped in it's almost like they stepped in like a white knight to save us when we didn't really need to be saved because we'd figured something out. And this is the argument of Holly Dawn,
Yeah.
one of the veteran journalists behind Blacklocks. She said like we 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 figured it out. We had to figure it out. We adapted
Yeah.
to changes. And the other outlets didn't. And ironically, it's the other outlets who are now being subsidized to continue to be out of date. It's
And if we
kind
look
of,
at Glacier Media stock, again, another abysmal one. It's like 13 cents. We could do this all day. Like this is not good. And here's the worst thing. Some of these outlets in Canada are actually owned mostly by the Americans. Like I think I don't want to get the name wrong, but one of the big ones that owns a lot of big publications in Canada is 60% owned by the Americans, and we're subsidizing that outlet like
Yeah.
to the tunes of millions. So Canada is subsidizing an American media outlets at the same time choking off Canadian independent media outlets. And when you hear Pascal St. Onge talk about how she supports local journalism, and Chrystia Freeland was a journalist, and here small media outlets like ours, independent media outlets are like ours, are getting choked off. Well, we fund American journalists, American-owned companies, I should say, and then we also put many jobs in the media at risk because I spoke to a CBC reporter, and they're worried that if Pierre Poilievre wins the government, that they'll lose their jobs. So, like, that's a boots on the ground reporter that is actually worried that he's going to lose his job if the other government wins. So, where do you think they lean in these elections?
Yeah, indeed. And that's the politicization of what should be a pretty sort of neutral
And
sector,
I
isn't it?
and I asked him to come and do an interview, and he said absolutely not, right? Because he'll get fired. One and two, like it's not a message that they want to share, but it's a feeling they have.
Yeah. It is interesting, sorry, just to go back to what you said about Pascal Santonge, though. She's the one that's kind of in charge of the online news act at Canadian Heritage. When I interviewed her last year, because she trained as a journalist, so she knows a lot of journalists. She didn't really work as a journalist though, but she knows a lot, sort of personally. She was telling me. Um, she said that she's like really upset that so many, in these, this is a quote, that so many journalists lose their jobs because advertising goes to a platform like Meta instead of to media outlets. And I put that in that story because I just thought that's the key line for me. She is very, very sad that journalists in Canada, and later on in that, when I interviewed her, she said, without journalists, you can't have democracy, basically. That was sort of to paraphrase. So journalists who uphold democracy are losing their jobs because advertising money is going to Meta. Therefore, the government must intervene to change that situation. And yet now here we are, fast forward like a year and a half or whatever it is, and the federal government, instead of giving money to media outlets to advertise, is giving money to Meta, an
Well,
American company that they say
this
subverts democracy.
this reminds me of an old movie, One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. Like it's just,
Yeah, it's
where you had to. I think that was the movie where you had to say that you were sane, but if you said you were sane, you're obviously insane.
I think like to just to try and get some sort of perspective on this, I'd say we're in the dying days of a government. I mean, it's gonna be dead. I mean, it is dead, really, isn't it? It's like a headless chicken right now that sort of is walking around in the
Yeah,
farmyard
but
as
it's
if it's
doing
still
is
alive.
it's spraying blood wherever it goes because it's we're like facing one of the biggest economic threats. And again, our journalism is kind of like definitely not operating as it should, holding power accountable, and it's not operating on all cylinders. And that I believe the reason that we're here at this point is because media has not been strong enough to hold power accountable, and they've had the liberals have had their way with media.
Well, I mean, yeah, the federal government, you could say, if you wanted to look back earlier, I'm not entirely sure about the kind of pre-Trudeau Liberals attitude to the media, but I mean, the Canadian media, something that I am aware of is the Canadian media sector has always been a bit kind of incestuous and narrow, hasn't it? It's never had the kind of media diversity of Britain or the US, and that's something that's a common complaint, isn't it, among a lot of intellectuals and just ordinary people. Very frustrated. I experience anyway when I speak to people, very frustrated with the lack of variety available
Yeah, I mean, if you
in
look
the
at it, that
Canadian media landscape.
our national stuff, I mean, CBC is obviously very like funded by the government, it always has been. And then CTV now taking subsidies, and like you look at CBC and CTV, they're very like the storylines are very close. I mean, there's some really great journalists on CTV for sure. Vasi Capellas, and I would say Andrew Chang on CBC. I mean, there's some great journalists out there. There's no denying that. And then like Global is like on the ropes. I mean, if you look at their stock chart, they're barely hanging on.
Yeah, and there's a few, and there's a few like Maclean's magazine, I guess, and there's some other ones that have popped up. But
But there's no like in
it's a
the
pretty
U.S.
dire scene, isn't it?
Yeah. In the U.S., they have the CNN, MSNBC, and then they have on the other side of that spectrum, they have Fox News, which is like one of the top outlets out there now. But then they have all these massive podcasts actually as well in the United States. The Joe Rogans and the different things like that. We just don't have that much diversity here in Canada, and I think taking news off of social media has really hurt Canadians, especially in our community with wildfires and that type of stuff. People scrambling to get information. I mean, I talked to some of the city councilors. They were basically trying to cut and paste, just like you said, that one guy. They were basically taking our stories and cutting and pasting them onto the Facebook, not being able to link back to Kelowna Now or Castnet or whatever. They just basically had to rip the content completely, which is really to the detriment of organizations such as ours. But I mean, they were trying to get information out, and it's just
Yeah.
odd that the safety and security of a community does not matter, but getting out. This is the part for me. Getting out the tax break on tacos and tinsel is so important to break the ban.
It's that's almost like the cynic in me, my cynic radar sort of picks up on that and wonders how deliberate that really was in that case, because that is like so obviously ugly, and it's such a bad look, isn't it? To break the to surrender your principles and break this boycott so that you can advertise your last ditch attempt to survive as a government. It's almost like I feel like the political operators in the Liberal Party would have said no. That's too obvious. Like let's break the boycott, sure, but let's break the boycott because of the Trump tariff threat, or let's break the boycott because of like I don't know, something that everybody can get around, like sexual assault or something, like just something that everybody will support. It's like no, we had to do this because there's too much of this is happening,
But
whatever this is.
I
And
guess the
then
cynic.
after, then you can do the GST. But instead, there's like, no, let's break the boycott for the GST so that we can survive as a government.
Well, the cynic in me would say that's part and parcel of a very selfish party. That is that really doesn't care about the damage that they've done to media, and you can't tell me that the media is healthier from the interference that the Liberal government has put into media.
Yeah. Well, it's this is what you learn as you get older, really, isn't it, about politics? Essentially, all politicians give you a false prospectus when they're trying to tell you what they want to do and what motivates them and so on. The only real way to judge any sort of political a political party, political platform, or a kind of one idea, that the only possible way to really judge it is based on the results, I think. And I think you should pretty much ignore entirely the motivations that they give you, or the kind of the PR spin on it, and what they're trying to achieve and so on. You should pretty much only look at the results. That's kind
So
of
then is the
that's what I
goal?
live by with
Yeah.
politics. And if
So
you look at
would
the results here, it's been absolutely calamitous, hasn't it?
would the goal then be to just like for especially for an out like ours is just like we're here to help. Just we would will they have their knee in our throat and saying hurry up and die?
Well, a couple of the people that I interviewed said that. I mean, Holly Dawn has said that two times, I believe, to you. I think she said it
Yeah.
the first time you interviewed her as well, which is that the federal government, does actually have a kind of hostility towards independent media, and that they are quite gratified to see them suffer because they're harder to control. That's basically her argument. But I put that to Michael Geist, who I would say maybe is a bit less of an insider than Holly Dawn. I mean, insiders in like has less contact with the people that actually run government, and just to kind of get that out of the way. And he said he does not think that. He doesn't believe that at all. He thinks that they're just incompetent. He thinks that. It was just it was kind of like a utopian idea that they didn't really know how to implement, and then they screwed it up, and then they were kind of caught holding onto a bag on fire and didn't know what to do with it. So and I believe I asked Dan Albus, and I think you did as well, asked Dan Albus along those lines, and he didn't think that either, did he? He didn't think that it was a kind of conspiracy. He thought that it was he just thought that they'd made a mistake, I think. And for
Yeah.
me, anyway, again, another thing, another guide that I go by with politics, if it's of any interest to anyone, is I feel like it usually is a question of incompetence, I think, when things like this happen.
Yeah, to
And
lots of to
and
some
that's
people
based
though.
on experience with
This
with politicians over the years and having spoken to politicians. I think we often think of politicians as like scheming Machiavellian type people who are like masters of the universe. In reality, there's a very, very good chance that the people that rule you are stupider than you are. I think that's a really important thing to remember. Like whoever you are listening to this, there's a really, really decent chance that the politician in charge of your life is less competent than you are at most things.
but
And I think that just look around you, that's kind of borne out, isn't it?
mhm. But let's also remember that lots of times the corrupt will use incompetence as the excuse and say, "Oh no, no, that wasn't corruption. I'm just incompetent."
Yeah. Although I don't, it's not something a politician would like to be caught saying. Like, oh no, don't shout at me, lads. I just don't know what I'm doing. I
Oh,
think they try and maintain that
we've
you
seen
know
we've
th
seen we've seen the ones in court when they defend themselves when like especially we've seen it just recently in the United States where some of them are actually gone to jail. Is that they just like, oh no, it's not. It wasn't corruption. It was incompetence.
Yeah, I feel like the classic way of admitting incompetence or trying to suggest incompetence is the old "I do not recall." When it's
Yeah.
like
Mm.
usually when it's something that they were absolutely central to, it's like, so why did you press this button? It's like, I do not recall.
I mean,
That's kind of that sounds like incompetence, doesn't it?
I don't want to beat this horse too long because we've done it forever. There's tons of stories on our website. You can go to read this story that Ian posted. Basically, it says Trudeau won't bow down. You go ahead and read that story. The frustrating part for me on Justin Trudeau is he won't give you a straight answer. He will ask the question and then he'll go into a 5 minute lecture, which is like he likes to do, which is the words are typically meaningless because it says you are here to support independent journalism when clearly that's not the case.
Yep, results matter. I mean, politics is a results-based business, isn't it? And that's pretty much all that matters for anybody that's looking at it from the outside and trying to make a judgment anyway. And
And
the results here with the media, they say that they want to protect the media, they want to protect independent media. I think it's probably fair to say that the independent media has never been so feeble and never had such like gloomy prospects as it does now. And it's not. Their stated aim is to defend democracy. That they're not doing it out of the liberals when they talk about protecting the media, they're not doing it out of the kindness of their hearts. They're doing it because they think it's a fundamental part of our civilization, and that without it, we can't really have a proper democracy.
And one of the things that,
So
we kept talking about though too is why don't other media outlets even defend what's happening to us? And it seems like, well, for the most part, they're worried that they might get cut off as well.
I guess so. Or maybe it's just one of those things where, like, if you get on one of the lifeboats when the Titanic's sinking, you're not really going to spend all your time thinking about the people that didn't get on the lifeboat. You just fast adjust to the new reality and row off into the distance, don't you? It's kind of I just think it's one of those things where it's hard to have empathy for somebody when you're not in that situation yourself. But also with this particular issue, I mean, a lot of them did lobby for it as well. They
Correct.
actually spent a lot of time and money to push the government into doing this because this idea of like Facebook and the social media companies monopolizing advertising and that being like unjust in some way, that's that's been going around the entire time I've been a journalist. That's been going around for ages,
Hmm.
very, very long time. I can remember that in England back when I was a young gun, there was a massive amount of resentment of particularly Facebook, and yet the British government didn't do anything quite like this. The Online News Act, I think the British government must have realized that it wasn't going to work, but A couple of other places did attempt it. Australia attempted it, didn't they? But
Yeah,
then they
they
kind of
backed
backed
off. Yeah,
off.
yeah.
Yeah, and the French were gonna do it. I don't think they did in the end though. But then it's quite complicated that with the European countries because they're in this like war with the American tech companies and with America really. It's like a trade dispute about various kind of online companies, tech companies. So I'm not sure how much you can really glean from that, but certainly, yeah, the British and the Australians, they've talked a lot about it, but they didn't do it. It's only really Canada that did it, and yeah, I mean it is maybe people are hardened to it now, but it is pretty crazy, isn't it, when you go on Facebook and look at news and you get that warning sign or whatever, it just says, you can't access this in your country. That's something that happens in Iran, It's like if you're in Iran or somewhere like that and you try and whatever, Google something like something that the Iranian regime doesn't want you to see, you'll
That's
get
that's
something like that. And yet if we're in Canada, we're in supposedly like one of the freest countries in the world.
well, that's what I mean. So like, it's like the media outlets that are getting funded by the liberals know that the funding ends when say the conservative government wins. So then it seems like they don't really want to tackle it because like it's like basically cutting off their own funding while they do it. And then that's the problem with being funded by the government.
Yeah, and I mean, I thought that was something that people could understand, people that present themselves, particularly people that present themselves as defenders of democracy. I really would have thought, just automatically would have assumed that they would know that. But it seems like that's not true. And this is part of a wider discussion on the kind of health of democracy, I think. But I mean, I get the sense that people don't get it, do they? They don't
Mm.
understand. They don't understand that it's a really bad idea to be dependent on the people you're supposed to hold to account for your bread, for your salary. You shouldn't be dependent on the government for uh, for your company to prosper or even just to exist. If it's your job to hold them to account and to do things and write things that are going to really upset them, that's ultimately what you should be doing as a journalist. You should be writing stories that upset the government. To be in a situation where you're doing that and the government also pays your wages, I mean, that's extremely dubious. Surely everybody can see can see that.
Yeah, like I said, we don't want to stay on this too long. And I mean, my final thoughts would be we would ask that the government repeal Bill C-18 and Meta to reinstate news outlets for the safety and security of Canadians and to allow media outlets to figure it out themselves and how they're going to survive or not survive in this new world. Doing this is definitely not helping democracy or business or because not every business should be surviving off of government handouts. I mean, Canada already has a bloated government, and like if every industry has to survive off government, then what do we really have here?
Well, yeah, indeed. Although we're hearing a lot about oil and gas lately. Maybe they're going to pay for it all.
Hmm. Any final thoughts, Ian?
Uh, I would just say my sort of overarching thought on this, what I actually think is that it's kind of just got out of hand, hasn't it? I think I'm sort of inclined, of all the people that I've interviewed, I think the one I'm inclined to agree with the most is Michael Geist, who said that they just didn't quite think through the second, third order consequences, thought that they could win this argument or this battle with Meta, realized that they couldn't, and then didn't really want to admit it.
So
And I feel like probably if it wasn't for all this tumultuousness and the imminent collapse of this government, I feel like maybe they would actually work on it and do something, but they just have so many other priorities now that
yeah,
this is like not even top 100 priorities, is it? I think there's probably nobody working on this, I
so I
would
do want
say. I mean, it's just gone, hasn't it?
I do want to add one thing because people ask me sometimes, well, why don't you just sue them? Because it sounds like you have a really good lawsuit. So we have talked about that, and I've talked to lawyers, and I'll give you Holly Doan's Blacklock's. Blacklock's what they're doing is they have a paywall, and the government buys one subscription and then shares it across. And I did the interview with on Friday, and that'll go up probably tomorrow, or you can find it on our YouTube. and then shares it across all the outlets. So they pay for one subscription and share it. And so that's her the way that she does business. And so they've taken from her a wage that she earns her revenue. And she's taken them to court. And I think she's been in court now for 10 years on this. And she's spent $500,000 so far. And I was advised when I talked to lawyers that you're probably going to win, Jim, but it's probably going to take 10 years. And they're going to keep appealing the decision. By that time, you're either going to be so tired of it or you're going to be broke or be out of business. And they count on that.
Absolutely. And that's also, I mean, any big beast, government or otherwise, basically adopts that
Well, their legal fees,
philosophy. Yeah.
are paid by you and I, where you and I have to pay for these.
That's
See
the
what I mean?
extra
Like, so
irony.
we're paying for both sides of the legal fees.
Yeah, and we're also paying our rival reporters' wages as well, which is
Yeah.
another hilarious situation to be in. I hope they appreciate that.
Like I said, it is basically the movie One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, where the only way to prove you're sane, I can't remember how the plot went or whatever, but like Catch-22, you had to think you're insane to be sane or something.
Yeah, that's an old that's kind of like an old predicament to find yourself in, isn't it? It's like, how would you prove to somebody that you're sane? And then all the madness that follows from that. And yeah, this is kind of that kind of mad, or maybe Doctor Strangelove levels of madness, where oh, Monty Python, your old favorite, could
Yeah,
easily be
Monty
a Monty
Python would
Python
be having
skit.
would be having a good laugh on, like, kind of like when you're trying to cross the bridge there in the Holy Grail, right? Asking the questions.
Yeah, I feel like John Cleese would do he would perform the role of the government bureaucrat in this one, and Michael Palin would be the journalist trying to just report the news.
Anyway, we'll leave it there for now. I mean, we continue the fight. We've actually got letters of support from a lot of MLAs and city officials here, sent off to Ottawa. We'll await their speedy reply.
Yep, unfortunately, the bottom line is what we've learned. I don't think many politicians really care about news. That's kind of the sad reality that we live in. They have like many other priorities,
Yeah,
like survival, for
uh,
example, staying in office.
we've reached out to Mark Zuckerberg's crew as well, and the answer we got back from them several times was no.
Well, delivered, it's quite interesting. Delivered to my inbox. The only time I've ever got an answer from Meta, I should say. They've only ever replied to me once. I must have sent God knows how many emails. I really couldn't count. But they replied to me once, and the person that replied was none other than a former staffer in Justin Trudeau's office, which
Oh,
I
nice.
just found that just kind of was a cherry on top, really.
There you go. Winning,
Indeed. So
winning, winning,
somebody's
winning.
winning. Yeah, probably not us.
All right. We do thank you for watching Kelowna Now.
Report the news. We live here too. We're your neighbors, bringing you stories that matter to all of us. No government funding, no outside.